thank you everybody. I'm really pleased to have been asked to come here this morning to talk to you about, as Sam said, a particularly egregious case study when it comes to publication bias and lack of research reproducibility, and that's clinical trial transparency. I want to tell you a bit about, I don't have to repeat much of what Zoltan said, actually set out the case around publication bias and the problems really clearly this morning. Thanks for that, Zoltan. But also about some of the initiatives that have started to try and fix the problem that around half of all clinical trials that have been carried out on medicines we use today have never published results. And also the new problem that's rearing its head now that we're trying to fix that problem, which is that we're now living in a world where we're getting more and more different types of information from clinical trials, from research papers to individual patient data being made available out there in the world. So how can we make sure that's actually usable? So as I say, around half of all clinical trials that have been carried out on medicines we use today have never published results. So people who make decisions about medicines don't know what was found out in around half of all the clinical trials done on those medicines. Thousands more clinical trials have never even been registered publicly, so we don't know they've happened. So there's a huge problem of missing information when it comes to clinical trial transparency. That's why we launched the All Trials campaign, and I've got a short video I'd like to show now, which sets out the issues just a little bit more.
When you talk about this problem to patients and the public, but also doctors and policymakers, they are appalled at what we've tolerated. We've had 3 decades of failing to fix this problem, and the time really has come to draw a line underneath it and fix it for good.
When I saw the doctor who gave me the diagnosis, I wanted to hear anything but the word cancer, but that didn't happen. When, a couple of days later, my doctor raised the possibility of a clinical trial, there wasn't really much of a decision I felt that I had to make. I genuinely wanted some good to come out of my situation, no matter what was going to happen to me. To find out that not all clinical trials were being published is just horrifying. It's an insult to me and to everyone else who volunteers to do these trials.
Doctors have unintentionally wasted huge amounts of money on treatments which either are less effective than we thought or were unnecessarily expensive, and we've exposed patients to harm by giving them the less effective of the currently available treatments, simply because clinical trial results have been withheld from us. The best currently available evidence shows that on average the chances of a completed trial being published are roughly 50-50, and trials with positive, flattering results are about twice as likely to be published as trials with negative results.
The vast majority of medicines we use every day came on the market a decade or more ago. It's these trials where half of them haven't published results, so for the medicines we use every day, information is missing.
How can they possibly run trials in healthy volunteers, or worse, on sick people, knowing that they don't intend to make the information available?
We need immediate access to the full methods and results of all trials on all uses of all the treatments that are currently being prescribed to millions of patients today.
Hundreds of organisations who have joined the campaign, including research funders, companies and academic institutes, have started serious discussions about all they can do to achieve more transparency.
Terms like trust and transparency haven't been closely associated with the industry. And at GSK we've realised there's more we can do to be more open and transparent about the research we conduct. And if independent researchers can come along and provide a fresh perspective on the research we've done, that's great for science, it's great for us, and most importantly, it's going to improve patient care.
Clinical trials aren't just done on drugs, they're done on psychiatric treatments, medical devices, surgical techniques, in veterinary science. Anybody who funds and runs clinical trials should sign up to the campaign. Yes, it's worrying about what you might find. Everybody has skeletons in their cupboards. But now is the time for more companies and more institutes to make a commitment.
We know that withholding the results of clinical trials costs lives, wastes money, inflicts avoidable suffering and harm on patients. And so I don't think it's any longer tenable to say, we didn't know.
To make medicine better, we've got to make clinical trials count. Please share this film with friends and family and sign the petition at alltrials.net. That's the problem. But there is a solution. There's now a global campaign for more clinical trial transparency, which has been joined by 87,000 people and more than 600 organisations around the world, including research funders, government bodies, patient groups, the pharma giant GSK, publishers as well, lots and lots of publishers. But the majority of groups who have joined are patient support groups. More than half of the groups who've joined up so far represent patients. And we've got groups from the largest in the world, the International Association of Patient Organisations, which represents 150 million patients' voices, right down to some of the smallest ones, like the Wyoming AIDS Alliance, which represents fewer than 100 people. Patients' voices have been at the centre of this campaign from the start. The message that asking people to sign up to take part in a clinical trial, with them expecting that whatever was found out would be helpful to patients like them in the future, but then, well, it's 50-50 whether that information will be made available or not, and that's an enormous betrayal of their trust, has been central to the campaign since we started, and is the reason, I think, something that for decades now has been a discussion among academics and among professionals has suddenly taken on a public face. The public pressure and the public discussion about this that has started since we launched the campaign 3 years ago has meant that just in the last 2 years, authorities and bodies around the world have started taking action. So in the UK, the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee of MPs produced a report on clinical trials about 2 years ago now and said that transparency is the biggest problem. The government responded to that report and agreed. The UK government said clinical trial transparency is going to be something they need to act on. In Europe, a new law on clinical trial regulation was being discussed when the campaign launched 2.5 years ago. And now that's got some really strong measures about transparency in it. So once this law comes into force in Europe, probably next year, clinical trials in Europe will have to be registered and make results available by law. In Canada, they've discussed and implemented a similar law. In the US, they're looking at expanding their current law, the FDA Amendment Act, to include more clinical trials. So soon, more of the clinical trials carried out in America will need to be registered before they begin and publish results within a year of their end. Again, in Europe, the European Medicines Agency, the big European medicines regulator, has proactively produced some policies to make more information it holds about clinical trials available in the future. So they've said they're going to start publishing clinical study reports, which are literally 1,000-page long documents about what was done in a clinical trial and what was found that companies produce when they apply to license a medicine. The EMA is also looking at how it's going to implement the new European law. So it has to set up new systems, new databases, new registers, new way of sharing and linking and making available different kinds of information from clinical trials. And it's figuring out the technical requirements to do that now. In the UK, again, the research regulator, the Health Research Authority, has introduced measures so that every clinical trial carried out in the UK since September 2013 had to be registered. And soon they'll be implementing measures to make sure that results from it get reported quickly and properly. Again, in the US, the big clinical trial funder there, the National Institutes of Health, has introduced a new policy which says that every clinical trial it funds needs to be registered before it begins and results from it reported within a year of its end. Again, in the US, the Institute of Medicine produced a landmark report earlier this year which said that because clinical trial data was produced by the participation of people, that it should be considered a community resource and therefore shared by default. Just to take a breath after all that. So, just in the last 2 years, all of these new initiatives, laws, regulations are coming in force, which will mean more clinical trials are registered in the future, more information, and lots of different types of information from them are all going to be made available. In fact, when the Institutes of Medicine produced its report, Deborah Zarin, who's the head of the US government's clinical trial register, clinicaltrials.gov, said that this is a landmark moment. This is a statement that expectations have changed. That if you're a researcher or research sponsor, there's going to be an expectation that you make data available at the end of your study. All of these discussions, all of these pressures led to something that was one of the turning points for our campaign, I think, which was, again, earlier this year, when the WHO said for the first time that it expects all researchers who run clinical trials, and whether they've run them in the past or whether they're going to run them in the future, to register those trials and to make results from them available. So a global august body like the WHO saying something like that, that's a big deal. So this is happening. It's happening, that more information from trials that haven't even happened yet, but also some from trials that have already been carried out 10, 20, 30, 40, 70 years ago is going to start to be made available in some way, in some form, in some place. Some organisations have started to proactively do this and to set up their own initiatives and repositories and platforms to do so. So GSK, the huge pharma company, when it joined the campaign, and they were the first and still the only pharmaceutical company to join the campaign, by the way, they made some very strong commitments to make more information available. And in fairness to them, they seem to be fulfilling their commitments so far. They produced a brand new portal, a website called clinicalstudydatarequest.com, where they said they were going to proactively make information from trials the company has carried out since the company formed as GSK in the year 2000 available, and where researchers could go to request access to other information from those trials and from trials GSK carried out in the past as well. Since they launched that portal, 11 other pharma companies have joined in this initiative. So there are now a dozen of the biggest pharma companies globally who've joined in on this online portal and said, to a greater or lesser extent, we're going to make some of the information we hold available. And they're asking researchers, independent researchers, anybody really, to come to that portal to request access to the patient-level data they've got in there by providing a research plan and by committing to publishing the results of the secondary research they're doing on this data. So it's a nice model, I think, that GSK and their collaborators have built up here, where they're demanding as much transparency from the people who are requesting access to the data to do secondary analysis as we would demand from those who produce the data in the first place. They're asking them to register their research plan and to commit to publishing results from it. It's quite neat, I think. And it's relatively new. It's only been online for about a year and a bit now. So far there have been less than 100 requests for access to data. But interestingly, probably to our surprise and certainly to the company's surprise, the vast majority of requests for access to data aren't coming from competitor companies or aren't coming from academics who want to catch out the companies in some way or another or rerun their analysis. They're coming from what seem to be genuinely independent researchers. Groups like there's a Belgian research group who are co-funded by, I think, DFID, the Department for International Development here, and the Gates Foundation in the States, and some other groups interested in international development like that, who are going to come along and request access about side effects from vaccine studies that GSK and another company have run in the developing world, in Latin America, in infants and children. So they're going to pool together information about side effects from a number of different vaccine trials. So to see whether they can spot any patterns, to see whether they can find out anything that will help them in the future roll out vaccine programs in a better way that will reduce side effects in the future. So they're pooling together and using information produced by GSK that GSK would never look at again. Why would GSK look at that? It's not their job. But because they're making it available, these independent researchers can come along and do some genuinely new and interesting things with it. So it's really nice to see that, and it's very gratifying as part of the campaign. Other companies are producing some other models of information sharing as well. Both of these American companies, Johnson & Johnson and Bristol Myers Squibb, have taken all of the patient-level data they hold from all the pharmaceutical clinical trials they've run, and both independently handed it over to two independent research groups. So Johnson & Johnson is working with a group at Yale, they're called YODA, Yale Open Data Access Project, and Bristol Myers Squibb are working with a group at Duke University. So again, they've just handed over all their data to these separate research groups, and the research groups are now mediating other researchers' access to that data. So a slightly different model of information being held in a slightly different way and accessed in a slightly different pathway, but a new and interesting model of data sharing. It's important to say, I think, that academics, government research funders, and charitable trial funders are a little bit behind the companies when it comes to figuring out how they're going to start sharing more information. I can't show you or tell you any models being set up by the NIH or the NIHR here in the UK, or by charities like Cancer Research UK here, who fund and run clinical trials and have the ability to make information from them available. They're just a little bit behind in their thinking, I think, and the companies have been thinking about this for a little bit longer, so the companies are setting the pace when it comes to sharing information. So there's lots of new information being made available. So what's the publisher's role in this? Well, we would say that publishers should join all trials, of course, and that means writing editorials, telling members of staff and everybody you work with about the campaign, sharing the information about the campaign, hosting the button, joining the campaign, really. There are also things that publishers and journals in particular can do to make sure that information that's out there is linked and findable, that trials are registered and more information is accessible. That's doing things like adhering to the ICJME policy on this, which says that clinical trials should be registered before they begin, using the standard 20-item set of registration. We also think that any published clinical trial information should include lots of information about its trial register ID, about when it was started, when it ended, the full title, so that researchers can find the trial and make sure they find the right matching information from it. We also say that, of course, information data sets should be made available and findable, as Zoltan set out, and that journals should audit their compliance with these policies. It's been really pleasing for us as the campaign to see that journals and publishers, who are really the forward thinkers when it comes to indexing and linking and curating different types of information have said they want to start sharing their expertise with people in different sectors who are now struggling with making the crazy infrastructure of clinical trial data available. What would success look like here? Well, here's one initiative called Open Trials, which is not yet really a thing, but has been funded by groups like the Open Knowledge Foundation and the Arnold Foundation in the US, who are particularly concerned about research reproducibility and data, which has been set up to deal with the next big hurdle when it comes to clinical trial transparency, which is that information about clinical trials, more and more of it has been made available in more and more different places. So there's information available on registers around the world. There are dozens of clinical trial registers around the world. In academic journals, of course, clinical trial results are published in journals. There's information in company repositories. As I showed you, more and more companies are setting up their own models of sharing information. There's information in things like systematic reviews run by Cochrane Collaboration and by health technology assessment groups. There's all sorts of other trial paperwork out there, from consent forms to press releases to other documents. How can we get all of that findable and together in one place? A suggestion by the Open Trials group is to set up one repository, one register of registers, where all that information is findable. It's an aspiration. It's what success would look like. And I've come here today to urge you all, as the people who know how to do this, who know how to find and link and curate different types of information together, to join in that initiative. Thank you.
Okay.